Very briefly, I want to talk about women and the New Deal. There are two women who really stand out during this time period. One is Eleanor Roosevelt, uh, who, of course, was the First Lady, FDR's wife, and she is considered by many to be the first modern First Lady. She traveled extensively around the country supporting different programs and different causes. She was a big supporter of women's rights. It's Up to the Women was the title of a book that she published in 1933. And she would often hold press conferences, but would only allow women to attend. So if you owned a newspaper and you wanted to cover this event, you had to hire a female reporter. She was also a big supporter of African American rights. She often encouraged her husband to call for an anti-lynching bill. Lynching, unfortunately, was still a common occurrence in the South during this time period. And FDR never pushed for a lynching bill. He personally supported in anti-lynching law, but felt that if he did so, that would cost him his support in the South. But as far as her support for African Americans go, she actually invited a number of African Americans to come to the White House as guests, including Walter White, who is the president of the NAACP, and Marian Anderson, who is a world-renowned opera singer. She actually invited her to come to Washington, D.C. and give a performance on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The second woman I want to look at, who I mentioned earlier, is Frances Perkins. And she was FDR's Secretary of Labor and the first female member of a presidential cabinet. And she played a role in the passage of a number of New Deal programs, including the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act. The last thing I want to look at is opposition to the New Deal. And let's begin with conservative opposition. So these were politicians who thought that the New Deal did not go far enough. It was giving the national government too much power. And one example of this was the Liberty League. This was a group that was formed by anti-New Deal politicians from both political parties, from the Democrats and the Republicans. As far as opposition from the left, these were politicians who felt that the New Deal was not doing enough. And the best example of this was Huey Long. Huey Long was the former governor of Louisiana, and at the time of the Great Depression was a U.S. senator from the state of Louisiana, and he developed what he called the Share Our Wealth program. He proposed that the American government give $5,000 to every American family and $2,500 to every American worker. And to fund this, he proposed a heavy tax on wealthy Americans. And he actually gained a rather large following. Around 4 million Americans jumped on board with this idea. There were around 27,000 Share Our Wealth clubs that were formed around the country. And he very well may have been a major challenge to FDR when he was gearing up for re-election in 1936. But we will never know because Long was assassinated in 1935 by the son-in-law of one of his local political rivals. Another example of someone who did not think that the New Deal went far enough was Father Charles Coughlin. And he was a Catholic priest from Detroit who hosted a weekly radio show that somewhere between 30 and 45 million Americans listened to every week. And he called for the nationalization of banks. Nationalization meaning that the government should take them over and run them. He was also very anti-Semitic. You may remember from world history that means he was very anti-Jewish. And eventually, the Catholic Church ordered that he end his radio broadcast. And the last two examples of opposition to FDR's New Deal. Dr. Francis Townsend. He proposed that every American citizen aged 60 years old or older should receive a check for $200 each month. There was a catch to this. To receive the check, the recipients must retire and they must spend the entire check by the end of the month. Now, how was this supposed to help the United States recover from the Great Depression? He felt that with all these people retiring, this would open up new job positions for other Americans. And if all this money was being spent each month, this might increase demand for certain goods and lead to an increase in production by certain companies. And as I said earlier, when companies increase production, they have to hire more workers. Well, that gives out more jobs. And once more people have jobs, then that's going to lead to more money being spent, the increase or a further increase in production, and the hiring of more workers. So very similar to what FDR called priming the pump. And finally, perhaps most surprisingly, the Supreme Court of the United States was a big hindrance to the New Deal. So as I said earlier, the Supreme Court actually struck down some of what FDR considered the most important programs within the New Deal, like the NRA and the AAA. To try to get around the Supreme Court, FDR proposed what is called the court packing scheme. So it was very frustrating for FDR that 9 old men, that's his words, not mine, were blocking his New Deal programs. And so he proposed a new law that would allow him to appoint a new Supreme Court justice for each one that was 70 years old or older. So in other words, there were 9 Supreme Court justices. And if there were 2 that were 70 years or older, he could appoint 2 more justices and increase the number to 11. Well, at the time, there were 2 justices that were already 70 years old, and there were 4 others who were approaching that age. So if this actually became a law, then FDR could have potentially added 6 justices to the Supreme Court, increasing the number from 9 to 15. Now, and if this were the case, then he would be able to pass just about any law that he wanted to. The problem was the American people and Congress both saw this as an attack on the traditional separation of powers created by the Constitution, and the law was rejected. But the Supreme Court left him alone afterwards. They essentially stopped blocking his programs.